Okay, so yeah, so tonight we're looking at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is occurring on the equinox this year, and the four of us on the committee will be taking four different approaches to that, which we hope will be enlightening and entertaining. And we hope for some contributions from some of you at the end of the talk as well. So I'll hand you now over to Graham, who will be leading into the first slot.
Okay, thank you very much, Kris. So I'm going to be talking about the Great Mutation and the shift to the element of air in my slot. So I'm going to share my screen. I can set that up. Here we go. So these two guys, Jupiter and Saturn. So Jupiter and Saturn were to the ancients, and until Uranus was discovered in 1781, they were the remotest planets in our solar system. And the slow orbits around the zodiac, Jupiter 12 years, Saturn just under 30 years, marked them out as the Chronocrators, or time markers. They were regarded as the rulers of the age, as opposed to the fleeting influences of the faster moving inner planets. So on December the 21st this year, we have the Great Conjunction. And a Great Conjunction is just a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. It was called the Great Conjunction because it was the conjunction of these two furthest out and perhaps in some ways most important planets. And such great conjunctions happen every 20 years. And each great conjunction takes place at a mean average of 243 degrees on from the previous one. So that's about 8 signs and 3 degrees on from the where the previous conjunction was, although this actual mean can vary considerably. So this is showing you where the last few conjunctions have been. So we had the conjunction in 1961 at 25 degrees Capricorn, and then the next one in 1980 and 1981 was 8 signs on. So going around the zodiac, now I'm getting confused. Anyway, the next one was in Libra, in early Libra. And this was unusual because it was a triple conjunction. So every so often you'll get not just an ordinary great conjunction, but a triple conjunction. And this happens where Jupiter crosses Saturn. So that's the first conjunction. Then Jupiter retrogrades and then recrosses Saturn on its journey backwards through the zodiac. So that's the second conjunction. And then you have a third conjunction as Jupiter again moves in direct motion and crosses Saturn for the third time. So we had the 1961 conjunction in Capricorn, then the 1981s in Libra, and then in the year 2000 we had the Great Conjunction in early Taurus, and now we're just coming up to the conjunction at the very beginning of Aquarius. So this particular upcoming conjunction is special. It's very special because it's the beginning of a series of great conjunctions in the same element, namely the element of air. And this moment in time that we are approaching is, or was, known as a Great Mutation or a trigonalis. In other words, a change of trigon, and a trigon or triplicity is the triangle of signs formed by the same element. So here we have the airy trigon or airy triplicity of Gemini, Aquarius and Libra. So this conjunction coming up at 0 degrees Aquarius, which by the way takes place on December the 21st, which is the solstice. It takes place a few hours after the solstice. So a very significant day of the year for a conjunction to be happening on. But this is the first of nearly 200 years worth of conjunctions in air signs. So within each element, there are generally 10 conjunctions. So we'll, over the next 200 years approximately, we'll have 10 more conjunctions in air signs. Now this great mutation that we are approaching, or trigonalis, was regarded by astrologers of old as a time of epochal social and political change, because we are leaving an element that we've been in for 200 years, namely the element of Earth. And that began definitively in 1842 with a conjunction at 8 degrees Capricorn. Now there is usually an overlap when these conjunctions transition from one element to another. And there's often a first foray into an element. So for example, if I go back to the previous slide, in 1980 and 81, we had this triple conjunction in Libra. Now this was a foray, if you like, into the element of air, because it came within the long period of Earth conjunctions, and after it, in the year 2000, we resumed the great conjunctions back in the Earth element. So that first foray, if you like, into air is not regarded as a great mutation, because it hasn't properly entered the following element. So this conjunction in December is the proper entry of the conjunctions into the air element. Now this cycle, 200 years in each element, obviously as these conjunctions go through all the elements, you get a cycle of 800 years. So every 800 years, the cycle begins again at approximately the same place. And the ancient astrologers called this cycle the maxima or climacteria. And it was regarded as having its beginning in Sagittarius. And the first Sagittarian conjunction in any series or cycle of conjunctions is called the Grand Climactic. And this happened, the first of these great conjunctions in Sagittarius, otherwise known as the Grand Climactics, there was one in 14 AD or CE, 809 and 1603. And the next one isn't for, I think, about 300 years from now. Certainly a long time in the future. Actually 2338. So the shift from Earth to air. So we've been trudging through the Earth element for the last 200 years. And Earth is about nature, resources, and capital. So during this period, we've seen improved living standards and comfort for many in the West, certainly not spread across the world. But there are, generally speaking, there are much longer lifespans. On average, they've doubled from around 40 years in the early 19th century to around 78 now. So 200 years ago, one most likely lived to the age of only 40. And infant mortality also is greatly reduced. However, this period has also seen the growth of the super rich, the super wealthy. So we have some people who you probably recognize and some who you may not, and I'll mention a few of them. This is Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, which is like the Chinese version of Amazon. Bill Gates, you probably recognize. Oprah Winfrey is very wealthy. This lady, and I couldn't find any non-copyrighted pictures of her, Lillian Bettencourt. She inherited the L'Oreal fortune, the perfume company fortune, and she was extremely wealthy and died only 3 years ago. We have a smattering of Vanderbilts and Rockefellers and Rothschilds. We've got Steve Jobs, founder of Apple. I think this lady's name is Charlene Heineken, who's inherited the Heineken dynasty that makes beers. And she also has a hand in running the company. And this gentleman here was the Nizam of Hyderabad. That's not his full title, it's got a very long title. And he was incredibly wealthy in the 19th century. And Jeff Bezos, the founder and head of Amazon, is the wealthiest person on planet today. I won't tell you what his fortune is because it just sounds so ridiculous, really. And also there are oligarchs and also had he lived, the heirs of Tsar Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov's fortune, they would be sitting on a fortune of 300 to 400 billion US dollars. So during this age of Earth, the fortunes of the wealthiest 0.01% have increased hugely. And also during the age of Earth, the period of the great conjunctions in Earth, the world population has risen dramatically. So here, at this point here, we entered the Earth element, and look where we are now at 7+ billion people. And of course, nature has been plundered during these 200 years with the rise of industrialization and globalization, with the resultant habitat loss, species loss, an increase in carbon emissions from the middle of the 19th century. So this graph shows you, excuse me, how much carbon emissions have grown since those early beginnings when Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions entered the Earth element in the 1840s. And also farming has, farming and the exploitation of animals has also been industrialized. So you have these huge monocultures across the world where single species of plant are grown. And often the original forestry or hedgerows are taken up to make way for this kind of farming. So, you know, there's been good and bad things about the age of Earth, obviously. But the shift to air will herald a great period of transition. And this transition will play out over decades. It won't be a sudden shift, but events may take place early next year or around the conjunction that may symbolize the death of the old Earth way of doing things and the birth of new air element paradigms, if you like. So air might bring some great positives, but obviously there may be negatives as well. It's not going to be a transition into a golden age, or that's highly unlikely, I would imagine. So air as an element is associated with ideas like interconnectedness. So technology helping people communicate more. And obviously in the last few decades, we've realized how interconnected the world is, and how, you know, how events affect everybody on the planet. Obviously climate change, but also political and financial events. We're all, you know, part of this great project, if you like. So there's going to be a greater and greater sense of interconnectedness as we move into the air element. Air is connected with social change and equality. So one would imagine that the kind of power blocks that we've seen during the period of the Earth element will break up, and hopefully we will all have a greater say in how things are run, and that will lead, hopefully, again, to greater equality. And then, of course, air is about knowledge and data. So we saw after the Great Conjunction in Libra, so we had like a foray into the air element for 20 years, and we saw the birth of personal computers and the birth of the World Wide Web. And so that was like a foretaste of what's to come. And obviously, everybody can see the trajectory of technology, how it's leading towards greater automation. There'll be more robots. There might be, well, there will be androids. There'll be all sorts of, you know, incredibly futuristic technology over the next few hundred years that we can't even imagine now, really. Even things like brain to computer communication, and that sounds far-fetched, but it's already beginning to happen. And then there'll be brain-to-brain communication, which sounds awful, and it probably could be, but for some people it might open up new vistas. And then there's the idea of decentralization. So perhaps the movement away from concentrations of wealth to hopefully more decentralized spreading of wealth, and also things like decentralizing the production of power. So it might move away, or it is moving away from power stations and fossil fuels to smaller, more agile production methods like wind and solar. And we might, who knows, we might all end up generating our own energy in the next few decades even. So those are some of the sort of the general principles perhaps of the shift to air. And I hope that during the discussion later on that you'll come up with some ideas of your own about this particular shift and where it's headed. So I'm going to hand you now over to Kris.
Okay, thanks Graham for that, and that gives us a good overview of starting. So I just need to share my screen. So what I'm going to be doing is following on from that and looking at how some of these conjunctions throughout history have been received or considered by astrologers, because they've obviously been considered important for a very long time. Okay, they come around every 20 years, so that's a lot of conjunctions. So I'm just going to do a quick tour of ones that have been considered historically significant. We also have to remember that, as Graham kind of touched on, for much of the historical period, life expectancy meant that you might only see one or possibly two of these great conjunctions in a lifetime. So yeah, here's Jupiter saying, can you get your dragons to go a bit faster, Saturn, please? But of course, Jupiter always eventually manages to overtake Saturn. I'm going to put up some basic charts using just visible planets largely, because that's what for most of history would have been available. I won't be going into these charts in detail, but it's more to just to give a general overview. So next screen. So these are the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC. And we can see this as a triple conjunction, and this has been associated with, it's one candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Now, Mesopotamian astrologers would certainly have been interested in this conjunction. And so if the story in Matthew's Gospel is based on reality, this is one of the things that might have fed into the Star of Bethlehem story. I'd say it's probably just one of a number of significant astrological events that happened at the time, including a number of close conjunctions with other planets, comets, occultations of Jupiter by the moon, and most likely a supernova in 5 BC. And this slide gives you an idea of what happens when you get 3 conjunctions, because what happens, I've got my props here. The planets come along, they come along like this, and then they, because of the relative movements, they go back again, and then Jupiter moves on. And one of the interesting things we need to know about this conjunction is its proximity when viewed from Earth. Normally when we talk about planets being conjunct, we're talking about them conjuncting longitude. So when we see them in the sky, they're something like that. So Jupiter catches up Saturn and then goes past it. This time they're going to be actually very close when viewed from the Earth. They're not quite joined, but you will be able to differentiate between them. But it's quite unusual to have such a close conjunction. So we can see this one is in Pisces, and as Graham mentioned, that was a change into a new Grand Climactic. What do we call it? Climactic. Now, interesting enough, the next really important one, this has been referred to as the Muhammad conjunction. We have some nice iconography on the bottom right there. Looks very similar to Christian iconography about the birth of Christ. This was the start of a water trigon. And yeah, we can see the conjunction at the beginning of Scorpio. So again, that would have been considered particularly significant because it being the start of that new trigon. Again, we're talking about more probably of Eastern Arabic astrology being interested in this. We don't have much evidence, I guess, for Western astrology, as it were, in terms of Western European astrology at this time. And we also have Central American astrology. They were very interested in things like this. So the Mayan culture was, from what we can tell, very astrologically based. Whole groups of buildings were set out to enable rituals to be carried out to represent movements of the planets. And this was the Great Conjunction at Palenque in Mexico. And there is evidence, written evidence in terms of inscriptions on stone about this. A good book for this sort of work is Anthony of Venice, Conversing with the Gods. And he says that in this particular conjunction at Palenque, it seems there was an enormous ritual that they designed buildings around it because their astrological maths was quite good, so they could predict things quite some way ahead, and they knew this conjunction was happening. And a key thing here is, of course, we've got Mars in the picture. So they call this the 3 gods joined who cross the sky, because Mercury and Jupiter, the other godly planets, circle around the sun. They're always close to the sun, but Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars go around the sky, all around the sky together. And here they're together, and they seem to think that this was the gods acting out the creation of the world. So, like, they'd come back to a point where they'd started. Of course, we don't know that much about what they actually decided that was about, but it is fascinating that we do have the archaeological evidence for this attention being given. So back to Europe, I'm going to move on to this one. Interestingly enough, we have Mars, Jupiter and Saturn together again. Now, of course, in Western astrology, Saturn was considered the greater malefic, Jupiter the greater benefic. So it's one of the things we consider in astrology is those two opposing principles merging together at this point. But here we've got Mars as well, which is considered the lesser malefic. Now, it doesn't look as though in 1345 people were writing about this. Well, I'm sure they were. We don't have evidence of it. But this became known as the Black Death conjunction because on the equinox of 1348, King Philip VI of France ordered a report on the causes of bubonic plague from the University of Paris Faculty of Medicine. And this was what they decided had caused the bubonic plague. It was this conjunction with the Mars associated with it in 1345. This is also a solar eclipse, not visible from Europe, but the lunar eclipse 2 weeks later was visible, and that was also considered part of the picture, causing a great pestilence in the air, they described it as. As a reminder, of our current pandemic is nowhere near the most virulent in history. The Black Death maybe killed half the population in Europe, and not just Europe, Asian countries as well. This is commissioned by the Faculty of Medicine because doctors were expected to be knowledgeable about astrology. In fact, it was one of their diagnostic tools. And although I got a quote from Froissart's Chronicles, which were written in about 1400, one of the source materials for some of Shakespeare's plays, he says, doctors need 3 qualifications: to be able to lie and not get caught, to pretend to be honest, and to cause death without guilt. So, yeah, I think that without guilt means they don't have guilt, or maybe we'll be more charitable and they assume they try and get people to die without guilt, so they're more likely to go to heaven. And we have another one here. So, yeah, so this is 1484. We're in quite early in a water trigon. So in years leading up to this, and we have to remember here, printing is now becoming quite established, so it gets much more easy to disseminate information and discussion about astrology. So around about 1470, the Portuguese Jewish polymath, I'd say, Isaac Barbanel, predicted that the return of the Great Trigon into the sign of Pisces would signify the arrival of the Messiah. And we looked at those Christ conjunctions and the Muhammad conjunctions, both in water. And so there was an enormous amount of discussion that we have evidence for amongst scholars and academia leading up to this. Of course, that didn't quite happen, but what did become related to this was the arrival or the increasing prevalence of syphilis in Europe, which happened in 1494. It was claimed to have been spread by French troops. It may even have come back from the New World, but it was probably just a slight mutation in virulence of the virus, of the bacteria. It's probably been around for some time. And yeah, we have a nice scorpionic conjunction for this disease. Probably up to 20% of the population in cities had syphilis for the next couple of 100 years, maybe beyond that until antibiotics came in. And of course, it was something that it had long-term consequences. The initial infections weren't necessarily so nasty, but it could lead to insanity eventually. And yeah, syphilis is a theme for Shakespeare. I think I would say there's good evidence that Shakespeare was syphilitic. You're not really supposed to say this, but it's certainly possible that that's what he actually died from. And all this is possibly from the mercury treatment. Makes your hair fall out, and it creates this sort of baldness. And it's very distinctive with Shakespeare. But if you look at the last two sonnets in the sequence, they're both very much about syphilis. Then we have the Great Conjunction of 1524. And we see this woodcut at the time. Here we have the planets up here in the sign of Pisces. And again, there's a lot of debate about this. And here we have all this Saturnian type of imagery on the left. And this imagery on the right, kings and the bishops. So again, very discussed, and because it was in the watery, cold and moist sign of Pisces, misfortune must manifest as flooding. In fact, many people predicted a second great flood that would end the sublunar world. As Nicholas Campion points out, the fact that this did not occur seemed to do nothing to discredit astrology. But what it did become linked to was the Reformation. So here's the chart for this. This is the eclipse which occurs during this amazing Pisces lineup. So you can understand why that would have been very startling to people at the time. And in terms of the Reformation, well, again, it's in Pisces, so maybe a religious theme. But the Reformation is quite a long process. Arguably starts in 1517 with Luther's 95 Theses, but it's very ongoing. It's interesting that Luther himself was born in 1483, but he managed to fake his year of birth so that he could say he was born during the 1484 Great Conjunction, because felt that linked in with this particular chart, that he was so involved with the Reformation. So this is the sort of thing that just goes on, and as printing gets more and more prominent, there's more and more discussion, and it becomes more and more available to people as there's more literacy. So when we get to 1583, it's the last in the watery trigon, and as Graham pointed out, that would be the last in a Grand Climactic. So this is really in my study period. So both the 1583 and 1603 conjunctions attracted a lot of attention. Lauren Cassell in study Almanacs and Prognostications talks about vituperative printed battles following prophecies about these conjunctions. So it's a bit like academics today debating things, but they were debating this sort of stuff at that time. And of course, you could do it for yourself by then. This is the book I refer to quite often in my studies. A brief and most easy introduction to the astrological judgment of the stars, whereby the diligent, well, I won't go on. Yeah, they like these snappy titles. I have to inform you that it is neither brief nor most easy, but yeah, it would be understandable to those of us who do modern astrology. Some things would be very similar and some things would be different. And of course, at this time, almanacs are available, which give you daily planetary positions and maybe make prognostications. They're not always accurate, of course. So the one in 1603, we move into Sagittarius, the new climactic, and kind of nothing that obvious happens, but I just need to mention Kepler. Of course, Kepler, the great astronomer from modern points of view, but he's astrologer primarily, astronomer, mathematician. he's an early scientist, really. And so this is a drawing he did of the trigon changing from water to fire. And in some ways, the 1603 conjunction, it marks the end of the Tudor age, the passing of the golden age of Elizabeth, and really the early modern period, the medieval period and the early modern period, where religion and magic passes into a much more cynical and scientific 17th century. So it's arguably the transition point from early modern to modern history. And to some extent, this is when astrology starts to become much less favoured and much less discussed amongst academia and possibly the public in general. But astrologers, as astrologers today, we still do look at this sort of thing as we are today. So just one final chart. And this is the previous Grand Conjunction in 2000. So this has been associated with the bursting of the dot-com bubble. This was when all these companies started floating on the stock market in the late 90s. And there was a tremendous amount of investment in them. And companies like Pets.com and Webvan, Boo.com, no longer with us. Others like WorldCom, Global Crossing, where did these all go? But some companies like eBay and Amazon, they're still with us. But there is a sense possibly, as Graham was suggested, that it's kind of possibly the end of capitalism as we've become used to. And this was maybe a foretaste of what happens when we move into air. So I'm going to move on now, but I just say Jupiter-Saturn, it's the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. It's not just some sort of strange bicycle with a large bouncy front tire and a rear tire that's always going flat. There are proper uses in this for astrology. So thank you, folks. I'll stop my share and I'm going to hand you over to Pamela Armstrong now, who's got some charts for us to look at.
So what I'm going to be looking at is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the natal chart. By the way, if my internet becomes unstable, I'm happy to turn off my camera if that helps with the sound. But I'll just keep going and assume it's okay for now. So yes, so I'm thinking now just about the individual. Let's bring this right down to how it works out in our lives and in our own personal charts. Jupiter, the expansive, and Saturn, the contractor, working together because a conjunction has a harmony and a compatibility and gives an ability for the planets to speak to each other in a way that can be co-creative. Some people who have had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction: William Shakespeare, Galileo Galilei, both born in the same year, Blaise Pascal, the polymath, Gustave Flaubert, the writer, Fyodor Dostoevsky, another writer, the incomparable Marlene Dietrich, Walt Disney, the wonderful and astounding Bruce Lee, Pele, the incomparable footballer. I think we're perhaps getting the idea that many personalities, types, skills, and abilities cluster under this conjunction. Barack Obama, President of the United States, Roger Federer, Meghan Markle, and Beyonce. All of these people have tight Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in their charts. And Aquarius Severn has a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in its chart, which we're very interested in and which we watch very, very carefully. But I'm going to be talking primarily about this man this evening. And this is Blaise Pascal, born in 1623, lived till 1662. As I said, he was a polymath. He was a mathematician, a physicist, an inventor, a writer, and a theologian. Pascal was both a natural and an applied scientist. He made important contributions to the study of fluids, pressurization, and vacuums. He was also a great theologian and contributed much to the theology and thoughts and beliefs of his time in terms of his writings. And he knew Fermat of Fermat's last theorem and came up with his own proofs and his own breakthroughs in mathematics. So he had an extraordinary brain. But what I want to look at is in 1642, while still a teenager, he was 19, he started his pioneering work on calculating machines. So let's look at his chart, and immediately in the first we can identify the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in creative Leo, a very close, a very tight conjunction, and it's at 0 degrees, coming up to maybe 1 degree because it's 46 minutes, 3 degrees Leo. And if we scan quickly around the chart, there are no other planets in really, really tight aspect to that conjunction. It makes a square to the nodal axis, so it's at the bends. We know that that's a very, very powerful aspect in a personal chart, and takes your fate out of your hands in a way, and hands your destiny over to something beyond the parameters of your own life. So anything that you find at the bends is important. And here we have a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the bends. I'm not going to go on the timing of this chart because, it was in 1623, and just who knows about the time. And we can assume his moon was in Pisces, but I'm not going to hedge a bet as to just exactly how accurate this chart is. But we do know that there was this tight Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Let's look at when he was 19 in 1642, when he started this extraordinary year of invention, when he came up with this completely new thing. Don't forget, the mechanical implements were rare and unusual and took an enormous amount of craft and knowledge to put together, let alone design. So in this chart, we can see that year, we have a cracking Mars, transiting Mars in the 10th, transiting Pluto in the 11th, pressing down on that natal Saturn in the 1st, all of them at 3 degrees. There's a fiery trine coming in from the transiting Mars, activating, having gone past the Jupiter at 0 degrees and activating Saturn at 3 degrees, and Pluto sits on the midpoint of that pressing Mars, which is crashing forward. So here we are, he's coming up with this radical, innovative, pioneering idea. But it's an idea what happens. And in fact, it took him about 3 years to work this thing out. So he got it when he was 19, and he worked on it and worked on it and worked on it for about 3 years. So I looked at the transits in that first year of when he started to have this idea. And as we can see across the chart, in what might have been his 9th house, we see, and applying Jupiter to Saturn, an indication of a new Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And this is an interesting thing because it highlights and heralds that thing that can happen in astrology when what is in your birth chart unmakes itself over time and then gradually remakes itself in another form, in another place, and bears down on the natal pattern. And we do this obviously with the moon on a monthly basis, where we know what phase of the moon we're at, and it will repeat itself once a month for us for our particular phase. Well, here we have a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction beginning to remake itself. Now, I checked all the transits for this year, and apart from the applying Mars-Pluto conjunction, really the major transits, we look around the chart, there's nothing again at those early 0 and 3 degrees of any of the signs. So what might it have been that was forcing and changing and making this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction work, and out of it were coming these radical new ideas? So what actually happened across that first year was that transiting Saturn was sesquiquadrate natal Jupiter, and it was sesquiquadrate natal Jupiter on the 12th of March. And then transiting Saturn was sesquiquadrate natal Saturn. It started in April, it was a 3-hitter, so it came back in November, and then it happened again in December. And then also that year, transiting Jupiter was sesquiquadrate, natal Jupiter. And it was sesquiquadrate in June, in August, and in January. And so there is this great weaving together, not only of his natal Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, but this applying, transiting Saturn-Pluto, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, applying in the sky, replicating what he had in his chart in a certain degree, in a certain sense, not the same element, of course, not the same house, but replicating the pattern, that pattern of the mixing together of the Jupiterian quality and the Saturn quality. We'll just briefly go back to the chart and you can see it. If you see it, you wouldn't normally think that that would be necessarily an important applying, transiting aspect, but it really was, because it brought up this pattern, this weaving, this combined sequence of transits. It's always important to look at the combination and how they weave together in time. And what comes out of that? The first mechanical calculator in the history of man and woman. The transit to Pascal's Jupiter-Saturn conjunction occurred across the time that he pioneered his calculator. He built 50 prototypes before perfecting his design, at which point he then turned out 20 finished articles. This established Pascal as one of the first of the two inventors of the mechanical calculator. So I do want to highlight how tricky it will have been to actually make these mechanical things. We're so used to production lines. We're so used to having mechanical things around us. But he made this machine, however it was formed, and he would have ground it together. He would have had files. He would have had to ratchet it, put gears together, make it turn, make it work. It was a phenomenal task it's a supreme achievement. So let's think about what a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction can bring to us personally. It can bring a realistic realism, an optimistic realism. It can make one serious about principles and ideas. He was a theologian. It gives you a retentive memory. So while you're working for 3 years with your mechanical thing, you can remember your initiating idea. You can hold it in your head and you can keep grinding away. You have the Jupiterian inspiration and then Saturn comes in and holds it there. And you can keep working on your idea. You have a step-by-step approach to solving problems. You value steady progress and organization. You don't expect things to be handed to you. And you can see the potentials and limits of every situation. And out of this, as I say, came our first mechanical object for counting. So let's move on now to this room now, where we are now. Because where we are now is within the enfoldment of this chart, which is our chart. This is us. This is we. Here we are. We started in 1981, and there is our Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. We hear through the grapevine that this was particularly chosen by the people who set up our astrology group, which is the astrology group for everyone who is sitting in this room now, no matter where you are on the planet. We are Aquarius Severn. So I just give this to you and we can have a look at it. We can think about it. It's in Libra, which is an air sign. Here we are. We're all thinking. We use words. We're communicating ideas. And we always have done. That is what we do. I wanted to move on because what I wanted to look at was what's going to happen when the Grand Conjunction happens on the 21st of December. Because curiously, there it is in our 5th house at 0 degrees of Aquarius. Now, that's a sextile to our sun in the 4th, no, it isn't. It's sextile to the sun at that time. But it's going to bring us, when you think about it, in the 5th, an opportunity to be playful, to take risks, and to think about our creativity and what we want, how we want to actually go on creating. And in fact, one of the things that we're thinking about a lot at Aquarius Severn is how we continue as a group and as an organization, whether we go back into a physical room, whether we stay online. So watch this space, because at that time we're going to be thinking fifth house ideas, fifth house thoughts. So that's Jupiter, Saturn, married in the sky, bringing us confidence, bringing us optimism, and bringing us the discipline to do something about whatever may be in our minds, in our hearts. And let us bring forth something that is worth having, worth looking at, and worth sharing. Thank you very much. Gillian, over to you.
So, following on from that, I'm going to be talking about this particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the birth chart and how it might affect individuals with particular configurations. So I'm going to start off first of all by talking a bit about Saturn. As we know, Saturn is limits, constraints, time, difficulty. In the natal chart, it's found sometimes where there's a block, but also where there's a certain fascination with what's difficult. It's that part of you that relishes a challenge and that likes to have something hard to do and likes to make lists and tick things off. And it can define the great work of your life. And during a Saturn transit, because it's the planet of habits, it may be time to review habits. After all the habits you have are those of a younger person. So it's possibly time to review some habits that you have and drop what isn't working. It's a time to take on a great work and keep going and persevere with it, and to think about where you may have been underestimating yourself. So it's about facing reality, the fascination of what's difficult. There's a need for self-discipline and perseverance and giving something your very best shot. Jupiter, on the other hand, the planet of faith and hope and expansion and generosity in the natal chart, is where you're blessed, where you're given a gift. And during a Jupiter transit, it's a time to dream big. It's a time to find your inner magic, your invincible hero or king or queen. It's time to roll the dice and lay a bet on yourself and not give in to any form of lack of self-belief. It's time to be bold and seize the opportunity. I suppose the worst that could happen with a Jupiter transit is you step back and expect things to fall into your lap. You do need to seize the opportunities when they come. But the other thing about Jupiter is that you need to know what's good for you, to go for real gold rather than something that's glittering, to go for something that will make you happy in the long term rather than just some passing pleasure. So some key questions with Jupiter to ask are, how have I been settling for too little? How have I been underestimating myself again? And can I dare to act with hope and faith? So Jupiter is about faith and hope and power from the very core of your being, to embrace a benign universe. And these two acting together, because they're sort of opposites to one another, it's sometimes hard to think of how they can work together. And what came to mind for me is flamenco. I was taught by this woman, Ana Duenas Leon, for a while. It was the most wonderful week. But in flamenco, the energy is very grounded, it's very down to earth. And obviously there's the self-discipline, constant practice to get those footwork patterns and those beautiful arm positions. But at the same time, there's a fieriness, there's an upwardness and an outward passion about it, which I think expresses Jupiter. And there's that freedom within the discipline of flamenco. There's the freedom to express exactly who you are. So Jupiter and Saturn working together is really the great work, trying to find some noble, worthy, and probably because of Saturn, a difficult and time-consuming task, and really giving it your best shot. It's a time to turn dreams into some sort of practical reality. I've mentioned the importance of wise wanting, of choosing the right mountain to climb, and of testing whether what it is that you're going for is gold, really valuable, or merely something glittery that you're going to lose interest in. And a time to drop old habits. The last bit, if we think perhaps about someone who's deciding whether or not to have a family, they do so, and then a while later you ask them, well, how's it going? And the answer is likely to be, well, it's 10 times harder than I thought it was going to be, but my goodness me, it's 100 times better. So that has something of this element about it. So for us, given that this conjunction is going to be happening at 0.5 degree of Aquarius, where does that fall in your chart? And the questions that you perhaps need to think about are, in that area of life, is it possible that I've been underestimating myself? And if I have, how? What can I do about it? And maybe where have I been settling for too little? So, for example, in the 7th house of relationships, are there things that have been swept under the carpet? Are there things that you're unhappy about that you need to renegotiate? Where can you step out in more confidence in your relationships with others? And the 6th house, where can you, perhaps it's time to go for that raise, to really push things, or maybe to start working for yourself, to bet on yourself. The specifics are obviously going to be very particular to each given chart, but those questions can be asked in whatever area it falls in. If it falls in your 2nd house of possessions and self-worth and self-valuing, Jupiter is a sign that's Jupiter in the 2nd house. There's always going to be rice in your bowl. You're always going to be able to make ends meet. But with Saturn, there's maybe an anxiety about ends meet. So it's a time to think about, have you been settling for too little? Are you underestimating yourself? Could you attract more wealth into your life? Could you make steps that help you to grow and expand carefully and practically in that area? And so on and so forth. The conjunction is happening in early Aquarius. And so if we look at, if you have any planets in the early degrees of the air signs, Aquarius, Libra, Gemini, obviously there's the conjunction, and that's going to affect, have a quite strong effect, I imagine, on someone with a personal planet in early Aquarius. But personal planets in early Libra and Gemini, relatively easy to integrate the energies. It's a trine energy which is flowing, so I wouldn't anticipate too many difficulties there. But if we look at planets in fire signs, sextiles, again, nice, easy, flowing aspects. If you've got planets in early, personal planets in early Sagittarius or Aries, the energy flows well. It's a stimulating contact between those two. Of course, Leo is in opposition, so on the fixed cross, and so maybe there's some balancing that needs to be done. The need for Leo to be heart-centered pulls slightly apart from the sort of more detached aspects of Aquarius. But I think there's a need for both sides so that there's a balance. If we look at those who've got planets in the early degrees of Earth signs, Capricorn, very minor aspect, semi-sextile, relatively positive, and let's face it, Capricorns have had more than enough to deal with in the last year, and that's ongoing with the great triple conjunction that we've got there at the moment. I think when the Great Conjunction moves into Aquarius, perhaps it'll be a moment to breathe. But a quincunx to Virgo, which is sort of niggly, the grit in the oyster, the need for constant adjustments and subtle changes and something not quite right, but a need for constant adjustment there. And of course, Taurus, it's square. All the planets, all the signs that are on that fixed square have that in common. Aquarius is also a fixed sign, but it's a sign of fixed ideas. Whereas Taurus, and to a certain extent Scorpio, where there is another square, one of the water signs, perhaps they're not too happy with some of the changes that Aquarius might wish to make. Maybe a bit more of a challenge to integrate those energies. But looking at the other water signs, again, Pisces, just that side of Aquarius as a semi-sextile, positive, minor, and the quincunx to Cancer, again, that adjusting, constant adjusting energy that's needed. So as a summary, those people with personal planets in Aquarius, obviously, but Taurus, Scorpio, Leo, and to a certain extent Virgo and Cancer, perhaps it's a time for a degree of facing up to challenges and addressing issues that need to be addressed. The path may not be completely smooth. But what struck me looking at all these signs is that they're quite sensitive signs in various ways. And deep, and I think that they may offer some sort of necessary balance to the detachment and coolness of Aquarius. So in summary, Jupiter and Saturn need to be working well together in the chart. They both need to be healthy, and to do so, it sort of requires the interdependence of both self-discipline from Saturn and faith. If you have a mountain to climb or a great job to do or a great work, once you've discerned carefully what that is, then the way to achieve it is to stay faithful, to keep hoping, to keep confidence in yourself, that's Jupiter, and to aim with great faith, and to use Saturn as your method for getting there, slow and steady and practical and looking at all the necessary details. And together they represent the yoga of hope.